Hi, everyone. It's Saturday afternoon, and I'm going to do a brief reflection on your chat discussion from last week. I really appreciate the notes that you took and you were able to share with me. It gave me a nice overview of your discussion, and reading them next to each other, I could see threads of continuity across. It looks like you had a great conversation despite some of our technical glitches, and most groups didn't get through all of the questions, and I just wanted to note that that's perfectly fine. We care way more about the quality of the conversation than the quantity, and then it leaves a question or two to continue to reflect on during the week, and that's not ever a bad thing. So you began by talking about the dynamics of relationships, and which of course for a class like this is critically important since it's a course on parent-child relationships. And a foundation of relationships, your conversations brought up a couple really key points. One is about that our relationship dynamics between parents and children are reciprocal, transactional, that they are dependent on both people. And I believe in our parenting world that that's especially important for us to keep in mind, because too often when we write about parenting, or we study parenting, or we read a piece of research about parenting, or there's a construction of a parenting program, there's this idea about it's very top-down, very hierarchical, with we're going to teach the parent how to do something. The parent is going to behave in this way, and then it will have this kind of response on the child. And when certainly we know that when it comes to relationships, that actors are informed by the other actor, and that the parent responds to the child and is affected by the child, and that the relationship dynamics brought upon by the parent is a reflection of that child and of the relationship. So that bidirectionality, that transactionality that happens between the parent and the child is a critically important foundation for us. The second thing is your discussion about continuity and consistency over time. It's the idea that, our relationships are not defined by a single interaction, a single point in time, but really what are the patterns and what occurs over time. And that's very important. One of the groups, talked about an emotional bank account, and we encourage parents to think about the long game of their relationships and to focus on your action with your child, or your child's action with you at this particular point does not define the longevity of your relationship, nor should it define your relationship. So that second point about not only interactionality, but time and patterns and constancy, is another key element. One of the groups, and I was really glad they pointed this out, is that if you read the question, you can think of it in a positive way, as we often do, but you can also think of it negatively in the sense that, over time, that continuity, the consistency, the patterns of those interactions could build up over time to have a negative impact, a negative relationship. We certainly see this in intergenerational abuse and in trauma and our interaction patterns, which is why it's also really key, as we do in this course, to think about reflection on our past experience and how we have choices, or we can try to have choices to make changes. And we don't have to be defined by the past in terms of how we were parented necessarily. Then there was a discussion about Wiggins' quadrants of agency and communion, and again, I believe that this is a key foundation, because it keeps in mind there are two actors in a relationship. And if we think about like parenting styles, it just is from the parent's perspective, in this emotional context, the parents are providing through their own balance of warmth and demandingness, and that's fine, right? And we'll talk about that. But in this case, when we're thinking about relationships, we're thinking about the balance in the demonstration of agency and communion by the two people in the relationship. And that expression of agency and that assertion of one's beliefs of what is best, how they believe, how they act, how they view things, what is important to them. And yet in communion is also that focus on, but I care about being in a relationship with this person. And so therefore, what does my own expression of myself mean to sort of moderating, listening to being with this other person? And as parents, one of the groups, reflected that it's as parents, it can be a struggle to demonstrate that balance when, in a parent's head is, it's on me, right? It's my responsibility to assert what I believe is right for being a parent, for what, for socializing my child, for conveying my values, for our, the societal expectations, for my child developing in a certain way, being happy, being healthy, achieving, yada, yada. But in doing that, how do I do that in the same way that I'm also focusing on the relationship? And very often for parents, that can be kind of a struggle of how do I do both without feeling that I am lessening my sense of authority. And then we certainly see this then by looking at the two film clips, or the film clip and the TV clip. First from Dead Poets Society, and we see Neil and his father and what happens with a father who is very domineering and demonstrating very high in agency and very low in communion, right? He really didn't care to hear Neil's side of it, and it was his expectations, and he's demonstrating that. And then in contrast, we have Neil, who is very low in agency and very high in communion. He basically caves in, doesn't speak up to his dad. And we can imagine, again, if we think about patterns, sort of a lifetime of this dynamic between the parent and the child, of Neil continually feeling that he needs to cave into the demands of his father. And then in contrast, we can see him with his friends, and we can imagine, what Neil's own development might be like in a context that is more supportive of him and his interest in his own development and allows him some expression of agency. In contrast, then we see the Once and Again, and the daughter, and she's she's sad and she's frustrated, and the mother comes to her and comforts her, and the two of them are in communion through the support to Grace, the daughter. And the three groups, there was some variation on whether the two of them are high in agency and high in communion, or low in agency and low in communion. I think the larger important point is that there's agreement that the mother and daughter in that scene are, in contrast to Neil and his father, are much more in balance, right? The mother was much more attuned. She was reflexive. She was responsive to the emotions of her daughter. She reflected on her own history. She was there for her daughter. Her body language demonstrated a closeness. Neil's father's body language demonstrated closeness, but that was much more a nonverbal assertion of his dominance. But the mother in Once and Again is closer to her daughter. She's demonstrating, she's listening, and in response, the daughter stays. Right, her own communion from Grace being moody and being upset at the time is a demonstration that she feels listened to, and in response to that, she leans into the communion with her mother by staying in the conversation. And any of us who have been with moody teenagers knows that's not always the case. So we see this contrast, right, between the two, and we can imagine what would happen then in the future between, say, Grace and her mother. What does that mean for their relationship in the future? Probably it will remain positive because Grace will feel listened to, right? And her mother will feel reinforced and rewarded for her efforts to reach out, to her daughter. I loved that one of the groups too had, found that the question about communion may be more appropriately asked rather than how much communion is somebody using to really more how much communion is the person creating. And I love that, because that's the idea too, that our connections with other people is an organic thing, a living thing that can be created, that it isn't just an amount, that you pour into a cup or something. There were some questions, some sort of lasting questions about, this idea of balance, and what happens if one person is demonstrating communion and the other person isn't. And certainly, again, in parenting, we see that a lot, where a parent is trying to be responsive and listen, and the child developmentally is just not there. Right? They are into their own thing. They are storming off. They are not listening, and a parent needs to deal with that, right? And in contrast, if a parent is moody and the child, depending on where they are developmentally, may try to lean in more to communion, and the parent isn't there. So yeah, you can have that imbalance. I would just consider, again, this idea of time, that our relationships aren't defined by a particular point in time. It's for the long run. And then finally is this idea about, the role of the parenting educator. And I know a lot of you didn't get to that question, so I'll just leave you with that thought of then what roles do professionals as parenting educators, as counselors, as therapists, as social workers, in our support to families, what is our role in helping folks understand these dynamics and seek a balance? So I think that's about it. I think that your responses were really interesting and right on target, and a great way and a great foundation to begin the course. So with that, I will close and look for our discussion online as we move ahead and talk about Neuberger's Parenting Cognitions and the Siegel and Hartzell book, and reflecting more on prior experiences. So thanks, everybody, and I will see you online.